The laughter around the table cut sharper than the knife I was using to slice my piece of cake. We were in my son Eric's backyard in Charlotte, North Carolina. Plastic streamers blowing in the sticky summer heat, the smell of pulled pork and sweet tea heavy in the air. It was supposed to be a happy birthday celebration, but one comment shifted the mood for me in an instant. Lacey, my son's wife, held up her phone like she was documenting wildlife. "Pat, did you dig that blouse out of Goodwill's reject bin?" she asked, voice dripping with fake sweetness. The table erupted in laughter, some awkward, some genuine. My son, Eric, didn't defend me. He smirked. That stung worse than the humidity pressing down on my skin. I forced a smile, but inside, I burned. It wasn't about the blouse, it was about respect. Or rather, the complete lack of it. I set my fork down, folded my napkin, and took a slow breath. People think quiet means weak. They confuse thrift with shame. They don't know me as well as they think. If you're watching this, subscribe and comment where you're watching from. I didn't clap back at Lacey in that moment. I didn't throw my sweet tea or storm off. I just let the words hang, and I tucked the sting away where only I could feel it. But that night lit a fuse. Because I wasn't just Eric's mom in hand-me-down clothes. I was also something Lacey had no idea about, something Eric himself never fully grasped. See, I wasn't broke, and I wasn't powerless. I co-owned a company right here in Charlotte. And not just with anyone. With a man Lacey thought she knew better than anyone else in the world. Her father. That day at the table was the first step toward a lesson they'd never forget. My son's silence and my daughter-in-law's cruelty became the very keys to their own undoing. And when the truth came out, when her father introduced me in front of everyone, not as the woman in thrift store clothes, but as his equal partner in business, well, let's just say the smirk on Eric's face vanished faster than the last slice of barbecue. If that sounds harsh, here's how we got there. That night, back in my little two-bedroom ranch house on the edge of Charlotte, the ceiling fan hummed above me like it had every summer night for the past 20 years. I sat at my kitchen table, the one I bought secondhand from a moving sale for $50, staring at the empty mug that still smelled faintly of Folgers. I should have been used to moments like that. People have taken jabs at me my whole life, about my clothes, my hair, the car I drive. But hearing it from my son's wife, and seeing my son laugh, that was new. That was the kind of cut that keeps you awake at 2 a.m. The AC clicked on, filling the house with a low, steady rush. My hands traced the chipped edges of the table, grounding me. I thought back to every little choice I'd made that landed me here. I'd always believed that keeping the peace was more important than standing my ground. It's not worth the fight, Pat, I'd tell myself. Just smile, just let it go. But letting things go doesn't erase them. It stacks them, one on top of another until the weight finally tips. I guess I thought family harmony was worth sacrificing my pride. I thought staying quiet meant love would hold steady. But now, I wasn't so sure. I'd worked since I was 16, through waitressing jobs, office clerk gigs, raising Eric mostly on my own after his dad left. Every penny counted. Every coupon mattered. I made ends meet, not excuses. And if that meant wearing a blouse from the clearance rack instead of Mace's new arrivals, so be it. But that night showed me something ugly. Eric didn't see strength in that. He saw embarrassment. And Lacey? She saw an easy target. I leaned back in the chair, listening to the faint sounds of a late-night freight train in the distance. I realized the lesson wasn't just about Lacey's cruelty. It was about my silence. I had let people think I was small because I never corrected them. I had let my son believe that money and appearances defined worth. And maybe I even believed it myself, at least a little. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was, I had more power than either of them realized. Not because I drove a shiny car or wore designer clothes, but because I had built something steady, brick by brick, when no one thought I could. The irony, the very man Lacey bragged about, her successful father, trusted me as his partner. He valued my discipline, my honesty, my way of stretching a dollar without ever losing track of the ledger. He didn't care where I bought my blouse. He cared that the books balanced. And someday soon, Lacey was going to find that out. I picked up my pen and tapped it against the old notepad I kept on the counter. No plans written down yet, just a thought rolling around in my head. Maybe silence wasn't the safest choice anymore. Maybe silence had been the problem all along. The fridge kicked on, humming in low counterpoint to the AC outside. The streetlight flickered. I thought of all the years I'd swallowed my pride, kept my head down, and convinced myself it was for the best. But the truth didn't start that night. It started months earlier. Months before that barbecue, life in Charlotte had felt predictable. Not easy, not glamorous, but predictable. I worked as a payroll clerk at a mid-sized logistics company off Independence Boulevard. My days were filled with spreadsheets, tax forms, and reconciling timesheets that drivers forgot to sign. It wasn't exciting, but it was steady. And on the side, quietly, I co-owned a small construction supply company with Richard, better known in Lace's world as Dad. Most people assumed I was just his bookkeeper, and I never corrected them. I didn't crave the spotlight. I liked running numbers, balancing budgets, and making sure invoices got paid. Richard appreciated that about me, and over time he gave me more responsibility until he drew up papers making me a co-owner. Not equal, he had more stock, but significant. Enough that my vote mattered. I never told Eric. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I knew how he'd react. He'd see dollar signs, not discipline. He'd ask for loans or favors, maybe even pressure me to sell my share. And I wasn't ready to explain that my success came from decades of doing the very thing he resented, living frugally, saving carefully, reinvesting wisely. Eric was 32, working at a car dealership. He lived for appearances. Driving a shiny F-150 he could barely afford, flashing his Rolex knockoff, talking about closing big sales while asking me to babysit so he and Lacey could go out. He wasn't a bad kid deep down. He just didn't value the same things I did. Lacey was 29, full of sharp edges wrapped in Southern charm. She worked in marketing at a real estate firm and always made sure her nails were done, her Instagram full of vacation shots, and her circle at church impressed. To her, money wasn't security. It was social capital. And my thrift store blouses didn't fit her narrative. I should have seen it coming. The first time she came to my house, she glanced around the living room and asked if I'd considered upgrading. I laughed it off, said the sofa was comfortable and had plenty of life left. But the look she gave Eric was telling, half pity, half judgment. There were other little moments. The time I brought homemade deviled eggs to a church potluck and she muttered that I should have just picked up something from Whole Foods. Or when she bought me a Bath & Body Works gift set for Christmas and said, "Now you'll smell like the mall, not the laundry room." Each jab was wrapped in a smile, as though that softened it. It didn't. Meanwhile, Richard and I were building something real. He had the construction know-how. I had the discipline to keep our books airtight. We serviced contractors all over Mecklenburg County, supplying materials, managing accounts, ensuring deliveries went out on time. Our office wasn't flashy, but it was profitable. We had a couple of loyal staffers, and every quarter we hit our numbers. The funny part, Richard would brag about me to his golfing buddies. He'd tell them how I spotted a $3,000 billing error in a subcontractor's invoice, or how I negotiated a better supplier deal that saved us $10 grand a year. To him, I wasn't Pat in a thrift blouse. I was a partner. And he wasn't just bragging. He had paperwork to prove it. Buried in my file cabinet at home, in a bright red folder, was our signed partnership agreement. My name, my share, my rights. One line in particular always stood out. All financial decisions require dual consent from both partners. That clause was my safety net. Richard believed in checks and balances, and he trusted me to keep the scales honest. Looking back, that red folder was the first planted seed in this whole story. Lacey didn't know it existed. Eric didn't either. But one day, it would be the difference between their mockery and my vindication. The second seed was a photograph, a framed picture on Richard's office shelf. It was of the two of us shaking hands in front of a stack of lumber shipments, both of us smiling like fools after landing our first big contractor client. Every person who walked into his office saw it. But Lacey, she had never set foot in that space. The third was simpler, a receipt. One I tucked into my wallet and forgot about. It was for a church fundraiser where I'd anonymously covered the shortfall so the youth choir could afford their uniforms. Lacey later claimed I never contributed. That receipt would prove otherwise. But all of that was still in the shadows back then. What mattered in those days was that I kept my two worlds separate. Quiet bookkeeper mom on one side, quiet co-owner on the other. The problem? Silence isn't a plan. And when people think you're small, they act accordingly. Which brings us to the plan I should have made sooner. The morning after that barbecue, the North Carolina heat was already climbing by the time I pulled into the gravel lot outside our supply office. The place wasn't much to look at. Just a one-story brick building tucked off the side of Statesville Avenue, with a faded sign and stacks of pallets near the back. But to me, it was solid ground. It was where I felt most like myself. Richard was already inside, leaning against the counter with a coffee in his hand. He raised an eyebrow when he saw me walk in. "You're here early," he said. I shrugged, dropping my purse onto the chair behind the desk. "Didn't sleep much." He studied me for a second, the way only someone who's known you for decades can. "Family." "Family," I said simply. That one word carried the weight of every barb, every smirk, every moment I'd been made to feel small in my own son's house. I didn't tell him all the details yet. But I did tell him enough, that Eric had laughed while Lacey mocked me, that it had sat in my chest like a stone all night. Richard shook his head slowly. "You know," he said, "people mistake quiet for weak. But you and I both know the numbers don't lie. And paper talks louder than gossip." That was the first spark of a plan. I realized something sitting there in that office, looking at those stacks of invoices and the contracts pinned neatly on the bulletin board. My power wasn't in raising my voice at a family dinner. It wasn't in trading insults or showing up in fancier clothes. My strength was in the paperwork, the signatures, the clauses written in plain black ink. Our partnership agreement was airtight. Every decision needed my consent. Every quarterly meeting was documented. Every expenditure required a signature. I wasn't just a silent partner. I was a co-owner with the authority to call meetings, to vote, to demand accountability. And timing was on my side. Our next board review was scheduled just a few weeks away. Richard's larger family would be present, his adult kids, his wife, even some extended relatives who liked to drop by for the catered lunch that always followed. That meeting was the one event each quarter where business and family blurred. Which meant, sooner or later, Lacey would end up there too. I knew her type. She loved to orbit her father's success, to use his name as a social credential. But what she didn't know was that his success wasn't a solo act. If I played this carefully, the very stage she used to elevate herself could become the place where her assumptions collapsed. The plan wasn't about humiliation. I wasn't going to scream or throw accusations. I didn't need to. All I had to do was hold my ground, insist on the rules we had already written, and let the truth make itself known. Still, doubt lingered. Could I really go through with it? Could I stand firm in front of Eric, my only child, and show him that I wasn't going to shrink anymore? I thought about the red folder in my cabinet at home, the one with our partnership agreement. I thought about the photograph of Richard and me shaking hands, the proof that I was more than what my daughter-in-law painted me to be. And I thought about that receipt in my wallet, the reminder that even when I gave quietly, it counted. For years, I had chosen silence to avoid conflict. But silence hadn't bought me peace. It had only bought me invisibility. So, the promise I made to myself was simple. When that board meeting came, I would stop being invisible. I would stand as what I truly was, a partner, not an afterthought. And that meant the next few weeks weren't about waiting. They were about preparation. Then the pushback started. Preparation sounds neat on paper. In reality, it was messy. The first complication came from Eric himself. A few days after the barbecue, he called me, his voice already sharp before I even said hello. "Mom, Lacey told me you got all huffy at the party. You embarrassed her in front of everyone. Can you not do that again?" I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the small stack of bills I'd just paid, each stamped neatly paid in red ink. My jaw tightened. "Eric," I said, "I didn't embarrass anyone. She made a joke at my expense, and you laughed." "God, you always take things so seriously," he muttered. "Look, if you want us to come around more, maybe just try not to act so old-fashioned. Lacey's friends notice, and it makes us look bad." Us. That word twisted like a knife. It was clear where I ranked. The second complication landed at church the following Sunday. Our women's group met in the fellowship hall, the air thick with the smell of percolated coffee and powdered sugar donuts. I noticed the sideways glances before I even sat down. One of the ladies leaned closer, her voice low but not low enough. "Lacey said you're still working some little job. I thought by now you'd be retired, living easy." My cheeks burned. Lacey had painted me as someone scraping by, when the truth was I had chosen to keep working because I valued independence. The whispers spread like wildfire, and by the time service ended, I felt the sting of a dozen unspoken judgments. I drove home in silence, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. She wasn't just mocking my clothes anymore. She was chipping at my reputation in the one place where I'd always felt respected. The third complication came from the business itself. One of our subcontractors tried to push through an inflated invoice, nearly $5,000 higher than it should have been. Normally, I'd catch it, flag it, and Richard would back me up without question. But this time, Richard hesitated. "Pat," he said, running a hand over his face in the office, "that subcontractor's a golfing buddy of mine. He says it was just a mistake. Maybe we let it slide this once." I looked at him, stunned. Richard rarely let friendship cloud judgment. And in that moment, doubt crept in. If he wavered, what would that mean for me at the board meeting? Would my voice carry the same weight? That night, I pulled out the red folder and reread every line of our partnership agreement. My eyes lingered on the clause requiring dual consent. It was still there. It still gave me leverage. But leverage only works if you're willing to use it. Then came a small but important shift. Buried in an email from the subcontractor was a note, one line in the footer I hadn't noticed before. It said revised per verbal with L. Carter. L. Carter. Lacey's maiden name. My stomach flipped. Why would her name appear on an invoice connected to our company? She didn't work for us, had no business touching our accounts. Suddenly, things weren't just about personal insults, they were about interference. I printed the email, slid it into the red folder, and sat back in my chair. That was the first solid clue that this problem was deeper than family dinners. That's when I realized I'd been looking at the wrong problem. The clue with Lacey's name on that invoice stuck to me like the summer heat on a Carolina afternoon. I carried it in my purse for days, pulling it out at odd moments just to make sure I hadn't imagined it. There it was in black and white, revised per verbal with Elu Carter. She wasn't a Carter anymore, not legally, but that was the name she still used when she wanted to slide under the radar. It hit me that this wasn't just about jokes over blouses or whispers at church. Lacey was trying to slip into a place she had no right to be, my business. My sanctuary. The next Sunday afternoon, while the cicadas hummed in the oaks out back, I brewed a cup of tea and sat on the porch, the invoice spread on the table. I thought about every choice I'd made, keeping quiet, staying small, telling myself family harmony was worth swallowing my pride. But now I saw the truth more clearly than I ever had. My silence had invited this. By refusing to stand up, I'd given people permission to treat me like I didn't matter. I wasn't invisible anymore. Not to myself. That's when the plan shifted. Before, I'd thought the best I could do was quietly hold my ground at the board meeting, maybe let Lacey's father reveal my role. But now I knew that wasn't enough. I couldn't just wait for the truth to stumble into the light. I had to make sure it did. And I had to make it clear that the rules weren't flexible, not even for Richard's golfing buddies or for his daughter. I spent the next week combing through files, reviewing invoices, printing out contracts. Every evening after work, I sat at my kitchen table under the dim glow of the overhead light, building a binder. Not a binder of rage, but of proof. Dates, numbers, signatures. The kind of cold, solid evidence no amount of gossip could erase. I also called the county clerk's office downtown. It cost me $15 and a half hour of waiting, but I walked away with certified copies of our business registration, partnership agreement, and recent filings. My name was right there, inked into public record. If anyone doubted my role, they could look it up themselves. And then came the harder step. I picked up the phone and called Richard. My voice didn't shake, though my hands did. I told him plainly that I wasn't comfortable with Lacey poking her nose into invoices, that I'd found her name attached to one. He sighed, muttered something about his daughter just trying to help, but I cut him off gently. "Richard," I said, "we wrote the rules down for a reason. If we bend them once, we bend them forever. And if she's speaking for us without authority, that's not help. That's a liability." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then finally, "You're right, Pat. I'll handle it." I hung up knowing this was the first time in a long while I hadn't backed down. And it felt good. Days later, I got the email from Richard. Our quarterly board review was officially on the calendar. 2 weeks away. The invite list included him, me, and, just as I suspected, his family. It was no longer just a meeting. It was a stage. At dinner that night, I sat at my little kitchen table with a plate of leftover chicken and green beans, the TV murmuring low in the background. I thought about Eric and Lacey, their smug laughter, their casual cruelty. I pictured them walking into that boardroom, expecting the same version of me they'd always known, the mom in the clearance rack blouse who kept her head down. They had no idea what was waiting. I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to trade barbs. I just needed to follow the rules, every single one of them. And when the rules were applied evenly, the truth would stand on its own. The porch light buzzed as moths battered against the bulb. My tea had gone cold. But for the first time in months, I felt steady. I had stopped asking for permission. And I had started following the rules, every single one. The morning of the board review came hot and muggy, the kind of Carolina day where the air feels like soup before the sun even climbs high. I woke before dawn, pulled on a simple navy skirt and cream blouse, pressed, neat, not fancy, and slipped the binder of documents into my old leather tote. It wasn't about appearances. It was about walking in with everything I needed, no excuses, no gaps. At the office, the conference room smelled faintly of coffee and fresh bagels. Richard had ordered a spread, like he always did, to soften the sting of business with a little comfort food. His wife and kids trickled in, chatting, filling plates, taking their seats. And then Lacey walked in, heels clicking, holding Eric's arm like a prize ribbon. She wore a fitted red dress, hair perfectly waved, eyes scanning the room like she owned it. Her expression when she spotted me was priceless, surprise first, then annoyance. She whispered something to Eric, and he smirked. Same smirk as at the barbecue. My jaw tightened, but I didn't let it shake me. Richard started with the usual introductions, then glanced toward me. As you all know, Pat's been keeping this ship running smoothly. Couldn't do it without her. A murmur of polite nods. Lacey gave me the faintest of smiles, the kind you give when you're humoring a child. I slid the binder onto the table, flipped it open, and cleared my throat. Before we get into projections, I said, steady but firm, there's one matter that needs addressing. An invoice came through last month with unauthorized revisions, signed under the name L. Carter. For clarity, no one outside this board has signing authority. Period. The room went still. Lacey blinked, feigning innocence. Oh, that. Daddy asked me to look over a few things, just to help. I didn't think it was a big deal. I turned a page in the binder, sliding the printed invoice forward. It's a big deal. This is a legal partnership. Any change without both partners' consent is invalid and risky. Richard shifted in his chair, looking squarely at his daughter. She's right. Lacey flushed. Eric opened his mouth, probably to defend her, but I kept going. I laid out the certified documents from the county clerk's office, the partnership agreement with my name and rights highlighted in neat yellow marker. I spoke calmly, methodically, like I was explaining a ledger to someone who'd never seen one. The more I spoke, the quieter the room became. I pointed out the red folder clause requiring dual consent. I showed the invoice trail, each signed properly, until the one with her name. Eric leaned back, arms crossed, muttering, "This is overkill." "No," Richard said firmly. "This is how business works." I let the silence hang. In that pause, I felt something shift, not just in the room, but in me. I wasn't the background character anymore. I was standing squarely in my role, not asking for it, but claiming it. By the time I closed the binder, the point was clear. The rules weren't negotiable, and I wasn't going to be erased. Richard cleared his throat. From here on, all family members not listed on the partnership are observers only. No interference. That's final. His gaze landed on Lacey, then softened as he looked at me. "Pat, thank you for catching this." I nodded once, keeping my face neutral though my pulse hammered. The rest of the meeting moved on. Financial projections, new contracts, growth opportunities. But the tone was different now. No more smirks from Eric. No more patronizing smiles from Lacey. Just silence where mockery used to live. Walking out that day, binder tucked under my arm, the Carolina sun felt less oppressive. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't carrying invisible weight. I was carrying proof. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. For a few days after that meeting, I walked a little taller. My shoulders loosened. My evenings felt lighter. At the grocery store, pushing my cart past the humming coolers in the dairy aisle, I even caught myself humming. I thought I'd finally set the record straight. The first crack showed up the following Sunday. I walked into church, expecting the usual nods and small talk. Instead, the air felt off, cooler, charged. A few women smiled politely, but others whispered in little clusters. One of them finally said, "I heard you tried to block your son's wife from helping her father's business. That true?" My stomach dropped. Lacey had gotten ahead of me, twisting the story. To her version, I wasn't a partner protecting the books. I was a jealous, petty mother-in-law undermining her daughter-in-law out of spite. The gossip burned through the congregation like wildfire, faster than I could correct it. Then Eric called. He didn't sound angry at first, just tired, but his words stung worse than yelling. "Mom, can you just stay out of this?" Lacey was only trying to help Dad. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. I wanted to shout. I wanted to remind him I wasn't meddling. I was protecting what was mine. But instead, I swallowed hard and said, Eric, this isn't about you or Lacey. It's about the business. There are rules for a reason. His sigh on the other end was long and heavy. You're gonna ruin this family if you keep digging in. After that call, I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the framed photo of Eric when he was 8, grinning wide with a missing front tooth. That little boy used to think I hung the moon. Now he thought I was the problem. And then came the blow from where I least expected it, Richard himself. We were in the office late on a Wednesday, the hum of the copy machine filling the silence, when he leaned against the doorway. Pat, he said, rubbing his temple, maybe we should ease off. Lace is young, she makes mistakes. Family's complicated. Let's not stir it up more than we have to. The words landed like a stone in my chest. The one ally I thought was unshakable suddenly sounded shaky. If Richard started softening for his daughter's sake, where would that leave me? I drove home that night with the windows down, warm wind rushing in but doing nothing to cool the heat in my face. For the first time since I'd opened that red folder, doubt gnawed at me. Maybe I'd pushed too hard. Maybe silence had been safer after all. I sat at my kitchen table, binder open, papers spread out, but for the first time the numbers blurred. The certainty I'd felt at that board meeting was gone, replaced with a hollow ache. Until one line in an old message changed everything. I found it late one night, long after I should have been in bed. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I sat at the kitchen table with the binder open, flipping through old emails, desperate for something to steady me after Richard's hesitation and Eric's harsh words. That's when I saw it. It wasn't even a highlighted document, just a months-old email thread buried in a folder. A supplier had confirmed a bulk order of lumber, thanking Lacey for the quick approval. Attached was a PDF copy of the original order form. And there, in the notes section, clear as day, approved per request of Lacey Holloway, representing shareholder authority. Shareholder authority. My pulse kicked hard. Lacey wasn't just meddling, she was posing as me. She'd used my role, my legal position, as her own. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the words until they blurred. This wasn't about family drama anymore. It was fraud. She'd signed her name on something that could legally bind the company. If that order had gone south, if the supplier hadn't delivered, or if costs ballooned, the liability could have landed on me as co-owner. The anger came in waves, hot, cold, then focused. I went back through more files, tracing orders, invoices, emails. A pattern emerged. This wasn't a one-time slip. Lacey had been quietly inserting herself for months, using her father's name and my silence as cover. And then the real kicker. In one of the drafts, she'd copied Eric's email address. He had seen it. He might not have understood the full legal stakes, but he knew she was signing things. And he hadn't said a word to me. I sat there until nearly 2 in the morning, the papers spread around me like a storm had blown through. But somewhere in the exhaustion, a strange calm settled in. Because now, I had clarity. This wasn't about whether I looked old-fashioned in thrift store clothes. This wasn't about church gossip or bruised pride. This was about accountability. About the truth being twisted until someone stood up and said, enough. The next morning, I walked into the office with my tote heavy at my side. Richard was already there, coffee steaming on the desk. He looked up, tired. Rough night. I set the binder down, opened to the email with Lacey's claim of shareholder authority, and slid it across the desk. We need to talk. His eyes scanned the page. His brow furrowed, mouth tightening as he read. She signed this. More than once, I said. I traced 6 orders. She's representing herself as an owner. If one deal goes south, both of us could be liable. The silence in that office was heavy. Richard set the paper down, tapped it with one finger, then leaned back. Pat, I didn't know. I believed him. He looked gutted. This isn't just about family anymore, I said softly. This is the business. We wrote rules for a reason. If she crosses them, she puts everything we've built at risk. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, then nodded. You're right. I'll handle it. But I shook my head. For years, I'd stepped aside, let others handle it. Not this time. No, I said, voice steady. We'll handle it. Together. At the next meeting. In front of everyone. And for the first time since this mess started, Richard didn't hesitate. He reached for his coffee, nodded once, and said, all right. That night, as I drove home on I-77, headlights streaming past in both directions, I felt lighter than I had in months. The fear was still there, but so was something stronger, resolve. Now I knew exactly where to stand. The quarterly meeting was held in the same conference room, but this time the air felt different. I walked in carrying the same leather tote, binder tucked neatly inside. My heart thumped steady, not from fear, but from purpose. Richard stood at the head of the table, unusually stern. His wife, his other children, and yes, Eric and Lacey all took their seats. Lacey had dressed like she was attending a gala, not a board meeting, a sleek navy dress, diamond studs that caught the light, her posture rigid with confidence. She shot me a glance that said she thought the last round was hers. Eric leaned back, arms folded, wearing that same dismissive smirk. Richard cleared his throat. We have several agenda items today, but before anything else, there's an issue of governance we need to address. He nodded at me. My cue. I slid the binder onto the table and opened it to the email with her forged approval. My voice was calm, measured, but it filled the room. Over the last several months, company orders have been approved and signed by someone not authorized to act as an owner. Here's one example. I pushed the paper across the table. Lacey's name stared up from the page, bold and damning. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then she laughed lightly, tossing her hair. That's not a big deal. Dad asked me to help. Everyone knows I'm family. It's the same thing. Richard's voice cut in, sharp. No, it's not the same thing. You are not a shareholder. You are not a partner. Signing these orders was unauthorized. It exposed the company to risk. Lacey blinked, caught off guard. She opened her mouth again, but I turned the page, sliding forward more documents, each one with her name or initials. This isn't about family favors, I said steadily. This is fraud. Every one of these orders could have placed us in breach of contract. Suppliers trusted our signatures. If they'd failed, both partners, myself and Richard, would have been liable. That liability doesn't extend to you, no matter how many times you sign your name. The room was silent except for the faint buzz of the overhead light. Eric shifted, trying to interject. Mom, come on, you're blowing this out of proportion. I turned to him, my voice firm but even. Eric, this isn't about being your mom. This is business. And in business, you don't sign what isn't yours. Richard leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. Pat's right. This company is built on trust and rules. If we don't enforce them, everything falls apart. His wife, who had been quiet until then, spoke softly. Richard, what do you suggest? Richard looked directly at me. I suggest we formally reaffirm Pat's co-ownership. We'll record in the minutes that no family member outside of the partnership has authority to act for the business. Any future interference results in legal action. Period. The weight of his words settled like iron. Lacey's face flushed red, her voice breaking slightly as she tried to recover. Daddy, you're really going to side with her over me? I was only trying to help. She's making this into some vendetta. Richard's tone sharpened. Enough, Lacey. This isn't about sides. This is about responsibility. And Pat has carried more of it than you know. I stayed quiet, letting his words stand. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stop talking and let the truth speak. The motion was made, seconded by Richard's eldest son, and passed unanimously. The minutes would reflect it. My role was not only recognized, it was protected. The unauthorized signatures were officially voided, and Richard promised to notify our suppliers that only 2 names, his and mine, were valid. It was over in less than half an hour, but the impact was seismic. As the meeting wrapped, Lacey grabbed her purse, face stiff, and marched out. Eric followed, his eyes flicking toward me with something that looked less like anger and more like shock. Maybe even a sliver of recognition. He didn't say a word. The others lingered, small talk resuming, bagels being wrapped in napkins for the road. I gathered my binder, slid it back into my tote, and felt a calm settle deep in my chest. Walking out into the Carolina sunlight, the world looked sharper. The asphalt shimmered with heat, birds scattered from the chain-link fence, a freight truck roared past on Statesville Avenue. But inside me, there was stillness. For years, I had thought silence kept the peace. That day, I learned silence only kept me invisible. Speaking up, firm, steady, backed by proof, brought peace of a different kind. Then came the calls. The first call came that evening, just as the cicadas outside began their nightly chorus. Eric's name lit up my phone. I stared at it for a long moment before answering. His voice was tight, clipped. Mom, you didn't have to humiliate Lacey like that. I kept my tone even. Eric, I didn't humiliate her. She humiliated herself when she signed what wasn't hers. I just brought the truth into the room. There was a pause, then a sharp exhale. You've changed, he muttered, and hung up. He was right. I had. The second call came from one of the women at church, Mrs. Townsend, who had heard Lacey's version of events. Pat, I didn't know you were part owner of a business with Richard, she said, surprise softening her voice. Lacey made it sound like you were clinging on, interfering. I see now she left out some details. Word traveled fast in Charlotte. Within days, the gossip shifted. Some whispered with curiosity, others with respect. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't being painted as the poor, old-fashioned mother-in-law. I was the woman who held her own. Richard followed through, too. Every supplier got a memo with both our names in bold print. No orders valid without those signatures. It was a small thing, but powerful. At home, the changes were subtler. Fewer invitations to Eric and Lacey's house. Shorter texts from my son. But strangely, I didn't feel the same hollow ache as before. I missed him, of course, but I didn't miss shrinking myself to stay in his good graces. Instead, I felt something else, peace, tinged with strength. Still, life has a way of testing you just when you think the storm has passed. And just when I thought it was settled. It was a couple of weeks later, a sticky September afternoon, when the test came. I was at Harris Teeter, pushing my cart past the produce aisle, when I heard her voice behind me. Still shopping the discount bins, Pat. Lacey. Her tone was sweet enough to rot your teeth, but her eyes were sharp, daring me to flinch. She was standing there with a basket full of organic kale and imported cheese, her nails gleaming, her smile tight. The old me would have laughed nervously, brushed it off, maybe even apologized for buying bruised peaches on sale. But not that day. I turned, steady as a church bell, and met her eyes. I shop where I want, I said calmly, holding her gaze. And I don't need anyone's approval to do it. She blinked, thrown off by my tone, then tried to recover. I was just joking. You don't have to be so touchy. I leaned lightly on my cart. No, Lacey. You were mocking me, like you always do. But here's the difference. You don't get to define me anymore. Not in the boardroom, not in church, and certainly not in the grocery store. Her face flushed pink, the words sticking in her throat. She turned quickly, muttered something under her breath, and hurried toward the checkout. I stood there for a moment, surrounded by the smell of ripe bananas and the cool hum of the refrigerator fans, and let out a slow breath. My hands weren't shaking. My voice hadn't wavered. I had drawn a line in plain ink, not just at a conference table, but in the everyday corners of life. As I wheeled my cart forward, I realized something important. The battle with Lacey and Eric wasn't about one board meeting or one contract. It was about me finally learning to hold my own ground, no matter how small the arena. What I learned wasn't about them. It was about me. Looking back, I see now that the whole journey wasn't about blouses, boardrooms, or barbecue Snickers. It was about a misbelief I had carried for most of my life, that keeping the peace meant keeping myself small. I thought if I stayed quiet, people would value my effort. I thought if I bent, family harmony would hold. But silence didn't protect me. It erased me. The lesson hit hardest the night Eric told me I'd changed. He meant it as an insult, but I took it as truth. I had changed, and it wasn't in the way he feared. I hadn't become cruel or vindictive. I'd become steady, firm, unafraid to take up the space I had already earned. There's a kind of dignity in boundaries I never understood before. They don't push people out, they just keep lies from creeping in. For me, the boundary was a partnership agreement and a binder full of proof. For someone else, it might be a rental contract, an HR policy, or even just the simple word no. I also learned that appearances are flimsy currency. Clothes fade, trends shift, houses wear down. But character, the ability to stand up, follow the rules, and claim your place, that holds value long after the dress is out of season. And maybe the most surprising part, the world didn't fall apart when I finally said no. Some relationships strained, sure, but others grew stronger, clearer. And I could finally breathe without feeling like I owed someone an apology for simply existing. Here's the picture I want you to keep, a woman who once thought thrift store clothes made her small, standing in her own quiet power, binder in hand, no longer invisible.
A month after that board meeting, I sat at the same kitchen table where I'd once stared at bills and doubted myself. The chipped edges of the wood were still there, the hum of the old refrigerator still steady in the background, but something had shifted. The binder no longer sat open with papers scattered in panic. Instead, it was tucked neatly on a shelf, a quiet reminder of the storm I had weathered. In its place was a cup of hot tea, steam curling upward, and a half-finished crossword puzzle from the Sunday paper. Outside the window, the neighborhood kids pedaled past on their bikes, their laughter drifting in through the screen. I thought back to that barbecue, the sting of laughter at my expense, the way I'd felt so small. And then I thought of the conference table, the silence after I laid down the proof, the way Richard's voice cut through to back me up. Same me. Different stage. Different strength. I had learned that dignity doesn't come from shiny new clothes or whispered approval. It comes from knowing who you are, what you've built, and refusing to let anyone write you out of your own story. As the late afternoon light slanted across the table, I picked up my pen and filled in another crossword square. The house was quiet, but it didn't feel lonely. It felt steady. Rooted. If this hit home, subscribe and tell me your state in the comments. Your story might be next.